Okay. Well, Jeff, okay, let me go over to, sorry about this.
I think I was supposed to introduce him. Is that right, Stephen?
Oh, I was just going to start thinking about doing that. And let me turn it over to the moderator. I think I've moderated first person every morning except this morning. So thank you, Lucille. I want to just say about Lucille, she's indispensable for me. She keeps me on a normal plane, keeps me level, keeps us going too. So thank you, Lucille,
Yeah.
and take over.
Lovely to be doing this with you, Stephen, because the very, very first AMI conference, I got there indirectly because of you and met you there. So anyhow, without further ado, as you've heard already, and you know probably from the schedule, our next speaker is Jeff Crocker. Jeff is British, and there now, I think he said in Bristol.
Yeah.
He studied economics and then did a master's in philosophy of science. He worked internationally in technology strategy consulting for major internationals, multi-internationals, government institutes, as well as small and mid-sized enterprises. From 1990 to 2006, so that would be following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Jeff specialized in transition strategies in many sectors of the Russian economy. This year, Jeff published a new book, Rethinking Income and Money, Incorporating Technology into Economic Theory. And back in 2020, he published Basic Income and Sovereign Money, the Alternative to Economic Crises and Austerity Policy. And a month and a half ago, somebody who probably will be in this audience, Brian Winter, introduced me to that book. His earlier, Jeff's earlier book from 2012 already is a managerial philosophy of technology. And so he really explores the impact of technology on the economy, as well as the money and income system there based. And that last book is actually now available as a free download, and I'll post the links to those later. Jeff advocates basic income. He has a website that makes a case for it. I'll put that in the chat. His presentation today is titled Rethinking Income and Money, Incorporating Technology into Economic Theory, and it draws really on his body of work. Just as a reminder, what Stephen sort of already said, instead of having a Q&A immediately after Jeff presents, there's a very short break, and top of the hour, we'll introduce Oliver Haydorn, and he'll present on social credit, model for money reform. And after that, both Jeff and Dr. Haydorn will be available for a 15-minute or so Q&A. So Jeff, the spotlight is all yours now. Thank you for helping us to rethink income and money and how to incorporate technology into economic theory.
Well, thank you so much, Lucille, for that kind welcome. Thank you, Stephen, for you and your colleagues organizing this conference and inviting me along. And thank all of you participants who are joining this morning to show interest. So I will quickly try to share my screen and hope that you will be able to see. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so thank you. So do interrupt me if you
Not
need.
yet in slide set mode, if you want it in slide set mode.
It is here on my
You
machine.
see the slides, but we
Pardon?
see on the left side all of your slides.
But is it changing now as I change it?
No.
It's not.
Right.
No?
So I think you have to click on slideshow.
Yeah, I have done. And on my computer, I think somebody had this yesterday. I'm
We've got
changing
some
from one slide to another all the time now. Is that changing or not?
Not on our end.
Pardon?
Not on our end.
It's not. Now, Phew. So I'll go a second time to slideshow. Is that changing?
No, do you have two monitors by any chance?
Pardon?
Do you have two monitors by any chance that right now?
No, just one monitor. If I change now, is it changing the slide now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to be if I stay out of slideshow, it changes, right? But if I go into slideshow like now, it's not changing, yeah?
I think you might have had to, before you share screen, yeah.
I can start.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so right now
pull-
when you select share screen, you want to select the option that says I'm assuming you're using PowerPoint, so you want to select that option.
So I'm going to go share screen, and then it gives me entire screen, window, or Chrome tab. And I've gone to window. Maybe, I need to go to window. So I go to window. I share the PowerPoint presentation. I say share, and that comes up, yes?
Yes, it does.
But then when I put it on slideshow, it doesn't go onto slideshow.
I'm wondering, Alfonso, if we should go to slideshow and then share the screen. John, what are you saying?
I see. Let me stop sharing then.
Yeah, try. Well, if you
No,
can,
I'm back not sharing. So you want to put it on slideshow first. Okay, I'll do that. So I put it on slideshow first. But then, okay. I don't think that's going to work, but let's try it. And then I'll try and share again. Share screen.
So there's a little down arrow when you first start slideshow. It's up on the upper right, and it tells you the different presentation modes. So you want to hit the middle one so that it doesn't take up the whole screen.
Okay.
Then you can go to slideshow. I had to fuss with this a long time to make it work.
But I'm now on slideshow. Is it slide showing for you?
No.
No.
It's not changing. There's nothing I can seem to do to get it to go into slideshow. So I think I'm going to have to stay with this presentation because that does change the slide when I do that, yes?
Yes, that does change.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to stick with this.
Yeah, we can roll with
Okay.
that. People can increase the size on their end. So I will share the note, the how to do that on the chat.
Okay. Okay, well, again, sorry for that bad start. It's never happened to me before, actually, but I noticed that it happened to one of your presenters yesterday. Anyway, here we go. So, rethinking income and money, incorporating technology into economic theory, because in my view of our present economies, and this applies to most developed economies, we have two very significant problems. One is inadequacy of income, particularly for the lowest quintile households. And the other is that we're awash with debt. So debt both at the household level and debt at the government level, which then has very drastic consequences of seeming to prevent necessary social expenditure. So the main claims I make are that technology reduces labor income, particularly for that lowest quintile, that increased welfare income then becomes a structural necessity, versus work and wage policies. So classically, the view has been to get people out of poverty, to get them out of unemployment. We will provide, and the economy will provide, high wage work. Great idea until automation comes along and threatens our ability to do that by making high wage work less available. Then I will talk a bit about affordability and how one defines affordability, whether it's by real resources in economics or by financial balances as in accountancy. I'll talk about money being defined as debt or not at the point of its creation and the implications of that definition. I'll talk about QE and central bank purchase of government debt and the way in which, in my claim, that rendered it not debt. I'll go through the faultedness of QE and argue for the superiority of direct money financing to break that debt constraint. And then a little bit outside the conference's main agenda, I'll talk a bit about the core need to incorporate technology into economic theory. And I'll offer a core critique of contemporary mainstream orthodox economic theory. So apologies that my data is largely taken from the UK economy, but I'm presenting that as a case study of what I claim is a general phenomenon. And indeed, I'd be very interested if other colleagues had available research which showed similar data for their own economies. So this graph shows over 50 years from 1977 to the present day, the flatlining of real income for the bottom quintile of the population, which of course you see at the bottom of the graph. So whilst the top quintile has prospered, the bottom quintile and indeed the next 3 quintiles up haven't. So we find in the UK a level of poverty which is not expected in a developed economy. And I reference at the top of the slide the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report produced every year on UK poverty, in which they defined 14 million people in the UK in being in poverty, 6 million of those being in severe poverty, and including households where there is at least one person at work. So we're seeing the phenomenon, which we are well aware of course, the phenomenon of in-work poverty, which is demonstrating that work is not a necessary provider of income adequacy to all households. So we're facing income inadequacy in the economic system for a substantial part of our population. We see that labour income as a share of GDP has been slowly but surely declining over that same period. So this slide shows the aggregate labour share average of OECD countries over that period and tracks it with a regression line showing its decline from something over 70% to something only just over 60% of GDP. So this is an inexorable, constant phenomenon of labour income in decline as a share of the economy. And of course, at the same time, that produces extremely high levels of inequality. And any social comment that you come across these days will highlight the inequality that developing economies are producing. And the situation in the USA, of course, is even more unequal than this pie chart shown here for the UK income in 2022. Where the bottom 20% of households get 7% of GDP and the top get 43%. So the system is seeing an erosion in labour income in the aggregate GDP and a constant increase in income inequality. And of course, as we also know, wealth inequality alongside that is also escalating. So those are social conditions that we face as a result of the economic process. Now, alongside that, we see household debt increasing. So this again is for OECD countries, showing household debt as a percentage of GDP from 1995 to 2020, again showing an inexorable increase. Now, in the book, we do delve into that more deeply, together with my colleague, Dr. Joe Crisp, trying to examine to what extent household debt is taken out by households with higher income because they're able to afford the debt and buy a house, and to what extent it's being taken out by households with low income as they resort, for example, to payday lenders, lending them the monthly wage at very high interest rates. And there's a fair amount of evidence in the book to show that borrowing increases as income decreases. So it's again not necessarily an indication of prosperity, but it's an indication of poverty. So what are the possible explanatory hypotheses for this phenomenon? And I've structured them here into personal, political, and structural. So the personal explanation is that households in the low-income quintile lack income, lack prosperity, are in poverty for personal reasons. Either it's to do with skill sets, i.e. they don't possess the skill sets that are needed in the employment economy, and therefore the left-wing political solution to that is to propose training and further education, or the more right-wing view is that this is due to certain dispositional, motivational behavior of that group of people not wanting to get involved in the productive economy. And my own preference, of course, would be for the skill set argument, but with limitations, because as Robert Solow, the great late laureate economist, said, it's not really perceivable that we could take the population with lower skill sets and train them for the higher skill sets that the development of technology is requiring. So we still face a structural problem. Another set of explanations is political, i.e. it's rentier capitalism, which is redistributing to the elite. It's reduced trade unionization, which has reduced labor bargaining power, that's led to the inequality that we see. Whilst I don't deny that element, my own argument is more structural, i.e. that technology and automation have shifted the production function away from low-skill work, and that effect will work its way up the income scale from further automation via AI to affect work in professional occupations. This preferred hypothesis, and this is where it becomes pretty important, argues for an inevitable increase in social welfare income. So I'd extend my argument by offering the thought experiment of a totally automated economy. So if the economy were totally automated and we could plug in a machine to the earth that produced all the goods and services that we required without any labor, so there's no wage, so there is no means for which the consumer, the population, could buy the goods and services. Now, in that thought experiment, of course, the government would have to issue tokens for people to go and buy or get the goods and services that they required. So in this thought experiment, 100% of the population's income becomes a UBI, becomes a basic income. And also 100% of the money issued becomes debt-free sovereign money. Now, I'd be the first to acknowledge, of course, that we're not in that extreme thought experiment, but I am arguing that we are shifting along a spectrum towards it. And that shift requires us to accept an inevitability in increased social welfare income to supplement the decline in labor income. The question then arises whether such social welfare income should be conditional or universal. And in most of the conversations I have with leading financial journalists and politicians about universal basic income, their preference is for welfare income to be targeted, i.e. they say we have a certain amount of budget to help those with deficient income. We want to target them and get the money to them and not use the money for people who frankly don't need it. And of course, there's a strong argument for conditionality. But on the other hand, there are arguments against conditionality, ranging from the fact that the conditions become intrusive, they create humiliation, they lead to low take-up rates, and particularly the take-up rate for welfare benefits amongst the elderly in the UK is low. And more importantly, this conditionality leads to so-called unemployment traps and poverty traps, because the minute somebody finds work, for example, if they lose their welfare benefit dollar for dollar, they have no incentive to move into paid employment. So you end up with significant unemployment traps and poverty traps if the taper rate at the end of the condition is 100%. So there's an argument in favor either of reduced conditionality or moving towards universality. And universality has its own positive points. For example, we all have right to the inherited technology and infrastructure that we're born into. A universal system is clearly less expensive to administer. It demonstrates and it exemplifies the universality of citizenship. So there is that question between conditional and universal. And in the book, I now shift towards a small universal income, with a significant decrease in the conditionality of targeted incomes based upon research work and modelling that we've done at the Institute of Policy Research at the University of Bath in the UK, and also with macroeconomic modelling from Cambridge Econometrics in the UK. All of that set out in greater detail in the book, and also, as was mentioned earlier, on the website, The Case for Basic Income at ubi.org. So I'd like to slide in here to questioning the definition of affordability. Because again, when people critique basic income, for example, or when they critique a reduction in the conditionalities of targeted welfare income, one of the main critiques is to do with affordability. So I offer two definitions of affordability here, one of accountancy and one of economics. So the definition of affordability in accountancy is that we can afford what we have sufficient money for. So what we can afford depends on how much money that we have. This is clearly true as it applies to individuals and to businesses. And the reason it's true is because individuals and businesses cannot create money, i.e. with an accountancy, the amount of money is fixed. But in the definition of affordability in economics is that what we can afford depends on real resource availability. It depends upon the Ricardian concepts of land, labor, and materials that are available and their derivatives in terms of technology and equipment and, of course, time. So this definition of affordability from economics, I claim, applies to governments. And it applies to governments because they can, do, and must create money, i.e. in this definition of affordability, the amount of money is variable, whereas in accountancy, it's fixed. The problem is that we run into a constant category error where people, as you well know, and this includes some very leading financial journalists and politicians, apply the accountancy definition of affordability to the national economy. It's a category error. And who's right, I ask here, from these two quotations? Our famous J.M. Keynes, a British economist, said in a BBC 1942 radio interview, he said, anything we can actually do, we can afford, which sounds sensible except to accountants. Whereas Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK, last year said, we can only do what we can afford. And the question I pose for a provocative discussion is, who's right? So on money, switching to the subject of main interest of the conference, I offer two postulates to develop the conversation. One postulate is that money is not debt at the point of its creation. I know this is contentious, and there will be some colleagues who will challenge me on this, particularly from, if any, are from the MMT school of thought. I claim that money is not debt at the point of its creation. And the reason I think I can sustain that argument is that the moment before its creation, it didn't exist, i.e. money does not occur in nature. Money has to be created. Therefore, at the point of its creation, it wasn't debt, is not debt because it didn't exist the moment before. It hasn't been borrowed, it's been created. And from that fundamental point about the ontology of money, we therefore need within our accounting and economic accounting systems to recognize that there is an inevitable imbalance. The inevitable imbalance is the minute before there wasn't $100 billion. The minute after I've pressed the computer button, there is $100 billion. So there is an imbalance in the system that we need to recognize, but which central banks are extremely reluctant to recognize because they're desperate to show that they have a balance sheet which is in fact in balance. So anyway, that's my first claim, that money is not debt at the point of its creation. And of course, when money was created out of metal or out of paper, there was a certain cost to that creation of money. And as most of you will, of course, know, the seigniorage is the difference between the face value of the money that's created and the cost of its production. Now, when money is created digitally at virtually zero marginal cost, seigniorage is equal to virtually 100% of the face value of the money. And we'll see in a moment how that, to whose credit that redounds. There was a point, incidentally, when money in the UK had negative seigniorage. In the 18th century, it became the case that the bullion value, the metal value of the coin, was greater than its face value. And so people were shipping coins over to France, melting them down and bringing them back to sell them as metal. I think it's Benjamin Meyer's book called The Gallows Pole, which is a great historical novel about that. But the second point I make, the second postulate, is that central bank purchase of its own government debt is equivalent to zero net debt and is equivalent, therefore, to direct money financing. Now, in the case of the UK, to which, again, with certain apologies I refer, the Bank of England is owned by its own government. So when the Bank of England buys back government debt from a pension fund or from an insurance company, as it did under QE, then it's negating that debt. It's creating it as zero net debt between the government and the central bank. I'm aware, of course, that in the USA, the Fed isn't owned by the Treasury, but nevertheless, as I understand it, the Fed is required to pay any surpluses up to the Treasury. And so I claim it has a similar result. So those are my two postulates for arguing the case for money not being debt, for government funding not necessarily being debt funded, government expenditure not necessarily being debt funded, and towards direct money financing. So the practice here, which again, most of you will be well aware of, probably some better than I am, currently commercial banks are uniquely allowed to create money. They do this, as you know, when a commercial bank makes a loan to an individual or to a business. That money is created. The commercial bank gains its full seigniorage, which is virtually equal to the face value of the money for digital money. And it gains the interest that it then charges when it turns that money into a loan to a person or a business. And the money sloshes around the economic system. A lot of it ends up in the accounts of the pension funds and the insurance companies, and governments then have to borrow from that because they are prohibited in most jurisdictions from creating money in the way that the commercial bank is allowed to do. National debts, of course, then rise to exceed GDP. This, I would claim, is a delusory concept of debt. Of course, I understand they all roll over, but nevertheless, a debt which is greater than the annual GDP of an economy is unrepayable and is not really definable as a debt. We then find interest rates rising to contain inflation, which has happened in the last 2 or 3 years, and therefore the debt financing costs of this increased debt hits the government budget and enforces austerity. And there's an unsmiley at the end of that because the system seems to be dysfunctional. And I would claim that if a Martian came and looked at this system, they would be puzzled. As we all know, government debt has been rising inexorably and pretty well universally. The top borrowing there is, of course, Japan, where the debt to GDP ratio is in excess of 250%. But everywhere, there's been an inexorable structural change whereby government debt has been rising as a result of the government being forced to borrow for its expenditure rather than being allowed to create money for its expenditure. This graph is of the debt to GDP ratio for OECD countries, ranging from 25% in Estonia to 250% in Japan. And the only claim I make there is that government debt appears to be fairly arbitrary. There is no set rule. There's no defined debt to GDP ratio, even though in Europe and the Maastricht Treaty tried to set a 60% limit, which was breached by necessary practice. Here I look at the dysfunctionality of QE. As we know, in QE, the central bank entered the gilt market and it bought government debt in the secondary market, for example, from pension funds. And in our case, and I would be interested to know how you would comment it might differ in the US case, the Bank of England is not allowed to purchase bonds in the primary debt management office auction. thus hugely enriching intermediaries. So because in QE, the Bank of England bought in the secondary market, the actors in the primary market made a margin of £4.4 billion selling on the government debt that they were uniquely allowed to buy in the primary market. I would claim, and many would claim, that's pretty scandalous. Secondly, structurally, the bank purchased long-term fixed interest bonds with a fixed interest rate of 2%. Which then reduced in value due to the interest rate hikes which it then applied. And the loss on the capital value of those bonds is well over £100 billion if they were sold. At the same time, if it holds the bonds, the bank funded their purchase by creating reserves with commercial banks on which it agreed to pay variable rate interest. So it ended up creating 875 billion of central bank holding of its own government bonds. It was paying 5% at peak for the reserves it had created to buy those bonds, and yet only receiving 2% interest on the fixed bonds it had bought, generating a loss in excess of 20 billion a year. And in the UK structure, all losses by the central bank are covered guaranteed by government funding. So these losses by the central bank hit the public budget. All losses are charged, as I say, there through the HM Treasury indemnity of the Bank of England, which then goes on to restrain government spending on all the schools and hospitals and welfare payments that we need. The bank failed to publish any risk testing of its QE strategy. And I would claim, and I think others in the meeting held similar views, that this challenges the policy of central bank independence. So here we have an entity called the central bank. It's given independence, and it then wreaks damage on the economy to the tune of 20 billion a year if it holds on to the bonds, and over 100 billion if it sells them. That seems to me to require greater public democratic accountability and to question this central tenet of central bank independence. So I therefore argue that direct money financing is best. Other possible reforms are negative interest rates, which the UK was very loath to use. But there is a very interesting paper I quote in the book from the staff at the European Central Bank, claiming that negative interest rates could in fact be used quite creatively. Another reform is that the central bank should not pay full interest on the QE reserves that it created to buy government bonds, or at least it should tier those reserves and not pay a full interest rate on all of them. Now, there is significant support in professional circles for tiering these reserves that the central bank created. It includes people like Paul Tucker, who was Deputy Governor of the Bank of England and is now an academic at Harvard and with you in the USA. It includes Chris Giles, FT's lead writer. So there's quite a big pressure to consider tiering those reserves. Or that the Bank of England might be allowed to buy government debt directly to eliminate the margin that's going to the traders. But of course, if that would happen, it collapses pretty much to direct money financing. So direct money financing versus debt financing of government expenditure. First of all, of course, it would reduce the debt. So we wouldn't see these 100% debt to GDP ratios, and it would reduce the financing cost, which is currently about £100 billion a year in the UK. It would avoid austerity because we would no longer be saying that we couldn't afford welfare benefits because the debt to GDP ratio was at a ceiling and we couldn't issue any further government debt. We would be running the economy at full employment of its real resources, both full employment of labor and full employment of materials and technology and capital equipment. Whereas regarding the government financial balance as the constraint to expenditure very much threatens us with economies that are not running at full employment. Then I asked this question: if historic debt had been direct money financed instead, what would be the result? So if I take at the moment in the UK, the 2.8 trillion public debt, and even if I said, let's say that 0.8 trillion, i.e. 800 billion pounds built up over the last 20, 30 years of government expenditure, if that same amount had been funded by the government being allowed to create the money rather than having to borrow it, then my claim is there would have been no inflationary effect, because it would have been the same amount of money spent into the downstream economy, just it would have been created rather than borrowed. So the main effect would be that the pension funds and the insurance companies would have 800 billion over that time period more in their accounts and their funds. What would they then have done with it? First of all, they would have avoided the recent LDI crisis, where pension funds assets were hitting 70% were held in bonds, and allow them to invest in UK equities, or in your case, of course, US equities, more than in bonds, which is, I would claim, a win-win outcome. That's as much as I have on money, which is perhaps what you will want to focus on in the discussion. But here I'll throw in as extra interest the parts of the book that deal with technology and economic theory. So technology, as again we're all aware, is extremely determinative of the economy. Consumption, it determines consumption because it's creating new and refined products and services all the time. So, you know, the consumption function for mobile phones wouldn't have existed 30 years ago because mobile phones didn't exist. So technology is constantly determining consumption. It's also determining production, because by automation, it's radically altering the capital labor production function. It's constantly raising productivity. It's extremely important in production. It's also important now in distribution as well, as retail shifts to being online sales, and as warehousing and logistics becomes more automated. So consumption, production, distribution, all fundamentally redefined and changed by technology. Employment is changed because the skill levels required, the quantity of employment and the wage levels are changed by technology. And the income in the household income in the society, the economy is changed by technology at its level, the distribution of income, and the composition between labor and non-labor income, where my argument kicks back in that technology will reduce labor income and increase non-labor or social income in the system. It affects market transactions and outcomes by information flows on the internet and transaction processing. And of course, crucially, it determines the standard of living, because it's technology that via productivity increase and real price decrease increases the standard of living, including by driving further consumption. But having said all of that, classic economic mainstream theory excludes technology. And then I try in the book, and this is only mapping out a framework by which a techno-economic process might be developed for economic theory. So I show in column 2 3 different technologies. The first one is weaving, the second one is car production, and the third one is mobile phones. So for weaving, I show the creation of an automated loom, the deployment of that loom throughout the weaving industry, and the subsequent expansion of cloth output, both because the manufacturing capacity increases and because automation reduces the price of the woven product and therefore massively increases its consumption. And I try to track the effect on GDP of each of those moves, the effect of employment. So, for example, creating the automated loom will increase employment, but deploying it will initially reduce employment until there's a big expansion in the sector, which will then increase employment again. So then I try to say, what's the aggregate labor income effect? And these, of course, are all speculative, and show the economic dynamic with each of those steps to being in R&D, in capital investment, and then in capital deepening. I do the same for the automotive industry, the creation of the car, investing in its production and producing more cars, and then automating that car production process through robotization, and as a further round of increasing car output. And I offer the same thought process for a mobile phone, from its creation, deployment, and then the creation of mobile phone apps. So, of course, demand increases as economies of scale from mass production reduce product cost and hence reduce product price. And the big question is whether technology is labor displacing and or it's labor augmenting. And I offer a fairly extensive review of the literature, that with the main authors being David Autor and Daniel Acemoglu. That's all set out in greater detail in the book. So here I'm in a very tentative, embryonic thought process on the techno-economic process. And finally, in the book, I offer a critique of economic theory, because as many of you will know, economic theory is dominated by price theory. Price is supposed to determine consumer demand. Wage as a price of employment is supposed to determine employment demand. Interest rate as a price of money is supposed to determine money demand. And emissions pricing is expected to determine environmental outcomes. So, economic theory is dominated by price theory. Keynes, of course, showed that regarding the wage as the price of employment, and therefore expecting that if you reduced the wage you would increase employment, was fundamentally wrong, because the wage is not only the price of employment, it is also the expression of demand. So this neoclassical price theory is based on a model of the economy as a finely tuned price-sensitive instrument, rather than as a plumbing system which can be prone to blockages, creating, for example, involuntary unemployment, a la Keynes. The result is that in standard economic theory, we get very elegant, very extensive, probably to most of us incomprehensible mathematical models, except they're built on false assumptions. So this excessive abstraction and the inadequacy of realism is exemplified, for example, in consumer theory. In reality, consumers don't maximize utility by wandering around supermarkets with the utility function in their heads, working out how they maximize the function. They walk around a supermarket, probably buy the things they normally buy in terms of bread and milk, and other things according to what takes their fancy, what they've seen on television, what their friend tells them they've bought, and so on. And equally, producers don't produce to the point that equates marginal cost and marginal revenue. This is a beautiful theory of Economics 101 at Harvard, or wherever it is, claiming that because profit equals revenue minus cost, if you differentiate that equation with regard to quantity, then you set marginal cost as equal to marginal revenue in order to maximize profit. Mathematically, of course, that's very simplistic and true. In reality, producers just don't work like that. And I've consulted in industry extensively. That's been my career. And I'm not aware of one manufacturer, one producer who runs the business by trying to equate marginal cost and marginal revenue. There are lots of other behavioral dynamics behind consumer behavior and producer behavior. So the theory of mainstream economics is based upon false assumptions, excessive abstraction, and inadequate realism. And I argue in the book for the superiority of behavioral and experimental economics. Now, those who are contributing to those fields would recognize that we're in the early stages of developing those aspects of economics as theory. And I'm basically arguing for that to be massively increased. So that's it. And that's how I've summed up the book. And it was nice to see that Stephen had managed to get hold of a copy. I would be very grateful if you were interested in getting hold of it, but more so in recommending it to decision makers, whether they be politicians with a financial or economic brief, or economic journalists, or think tanks that are active in the economic sphere. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take whatever questions, although I think you're going to run those later, aren't you?
That was the plan. Stephen, can you speak up as to whether it's we still would have at least 10 minutes or?
Yes, you have the full hour. And then we'll have more time in the panel too, but right now you, of course.
So there can be questions now.
Yes.
Is it?
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, keep your questions concise, and we can go to them. I would encourage people to raise your Zoom hand, which if you're not aware, under the React button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click on that, you'll see raise hand as one of the options. That's how you do it. And I would encourage people who haven't spoken up at the conference yet to speak up. And maybe in that light, since Mike Holden, you haven't spoken recently as much as others, maybe you can put your video on and
unmute. Yep.
Unmute. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So in fairness, I was not available for yesterday's session. But anyways, Jeff, thank you so much for your presentation. I have to say, I'm in full agreement with all of it. And I think you really got to all the major deficiencies with today's modern economics, which was a major focus, of course, of Stephen Zarlenga and the work of the conferences that he established. So thank you for, really hammering that home and making it clear that today's economics textbooks and the way that we think about economics in our academic system is really deficient and it needs to be revised. My question for you is, it seems to me that you were positing sort of like an end phase technological state, sort of like a Star Trek civilization, where we have all of the technology problems solved. If that's accurate, then wouldn't we be sort of in an intermediate phase? And do we need solutions for this intermediate phase that it seems to me is replete with scammers and these tech oligarchs who want to siphon the wealth from the productivity of technology upwards as opposed to distributing it amongst the people?
Yeah, no, well, I fully, thank you, Mike. I fully agree, and thank you for your appreciation of what I shared. Yeah, we're not at this end point. So the thought experiment of a fully automated economy, we're not there. But I'm claiming that we are shifting along a spectrum towards greater automation of many of the things that we do. And this is having the major effect of sucking labor income out of the economy. I mean, I've never forgotten many years ago, I was working for Fiat in Italy, and I went to one of their engine plants in the south of Italy, in Termoli, where they were producing 2,300 engine blocks a day with 2 people there. And this is about 15 years ago. So it kind of made you start to think this is bound to be sucking labor income out of the economy. And I think the phenomenon that you highlight of the tech bros and this extraordinary inequality where you see people striding the earth like latter-day industrial barons, having sucked a huge amount of the value added to themselves and being frankly mega rich and exerting mega political power out of that is very troubling, but is a result of that same technology. So we then got to say, how are we going to mitigate that in favor of the rest of the population, to acknowledge that work may not be the source of income. Therefore, we have to accept the honor and the validity of welfare income. And the problem at the moment, as I see it, is that politically welfare income is either accepted because it's for people who can't work, i.e. retired people, children, disabled people, and so on. But for anybody else, it's regarded as a backstop, but really it should be calculated such as to force them back into work. So the incentives are all, you have to go and present yourself for work. But nobody's really honestly, not politicians, are really honestly facing up to the possibility that work just isn't there. And even in the UK at the moment, we have the Labour government that's promising lots of high-waged, high-tech jobs, which we've been promised since the middle of the 20th century. The problem is we're watching them disappear, because at the same time, the same government is making 30,000 of its own civil servants redundant, is making other central agency staff redundant because automation has made the employment less necessary. So it seems to me that we need a transparent, honest debate about this. But you're certainly right. I mean, we're not at the end point of a technology paradigm. We're on a movement towards that. And when you look at things like working hours, for example, I mean, working hours have reduced constantly from 100 a week to 70 a week to 30 a week to 32, whatever it is. So, working hours a week have reduced. I mean, this also, as well as political issues, raises huge issues for human philosophy. What it is to be a human being. What is the ontology of humanity? How much is work essential to the definition of being a valid person with self-respect and with respect in the community and so on? And how do we reconfigure our lives if, as Keynes said, at some stage we'll be working 15 hours a week? Now, he was wrong so far, because in 100 years' time after him saying that, we aren't working 15 hours a week, but actually we're moving towards it. So I'm not saying I necessarily have all the answers. I just think that this is a debate which needs to be had explicitly and with honesty, rather than the politicians constantly telling us they're going to create high-wage jobs.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I look forward to further reading your work, and I'll leave you with a quote from Stephen Zarlenga that philosophers should decertify economics as a science.
Thank you, Mike. So I've just jumped ahead to Carolyn, who I don't think we've heard from yet. So your chance, Carolyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucille, and thanks very much, Jeff. That was very interesting and very clear as well. For the most part, there was one little bit I didn't quite get, so that's partly what I wanted to come back on. When you were saying that money isn't debt at the point of creation, I suppose what slightly trips me up there is that it seems to be treated as debt. It's called debt, it's treated as debt. And is there a way to tease that out a little more and just explain that? Will be very helpful. And then just in terms of criticizing classical economic theory, I completely agree. And I just wanted to add something, and I'd be curious to know what you think about the ecological economic dimension to looking at economics. The idea that the economy is embedded in the environment, and the environment isn't just an externality. You kind of touched on this when you talked about the price theory and carbon emissions, but I think it actually does potentially impact AI, for example, which has massive resource impact and whose evolution may be tripped up by the fact that it's got this huge impact on resources, or it may become only available to minorities. So I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. And then finally, just moving on from that, what are your thoughts on overall economic goals? You've talked about raising standards of living. I wondered if you've come across the concepts of donut economics, well-being, the well-being economy, well-being economics, a sort of more nuanced, broad idea of what's progress and what we actually want the economy to do. So thanks for that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Carol. I mean, it's a very comprehensive set of points. And I usually say at the beginning of Q&A sessions, for me, there are more discussion sessions because I don't have the answers to every question. And I don't put myself as some sort of guru who has sorted it all. I mean, I'm part of the exploratory discussion with all of you. We're all standing on level ground. So having made that slight disclaimer, on money being debt necessarily or not, I do think that this is an idea which has grabbed the airwaves. All governments, all central bankers, all economists all say money is debt because it says on the dollar bill, I promise to redeem, blah, blah, blah. And generally speaking, those of us at the personal level and the household level and the business level do regard money, if we have got hold of it, we've either got hold of it as a wage, in which we regard it as our right, or we have borrowed it from a bank, in which case it's clearly a debt. But yeah, I do fundamentally disagree with the MMT school on this, because Randall Wray insists that money is quintessentially debt. I've tried to have a discussion with him about it, but the discussion didn't get very far, frankly. And he says it's quintessentially debt. And the MMT view, as you probably know, is that government expenditure can rise in the way that I think it could also rise, but they're happy for it to be regarded as debt because it's balanced by surpluses elsewhere in the economy, i.e. in the personal sector and in the overseas trade sector. There will inevitably be surpluses such that when you add all three sectors together, it will always add to zero. And they're right about that, of course, because Wynne Godley and Francis Cripps identified this equality, but it is a post hoc equality. It's not an explanatory equality. So you can't say, for example, if the government added 100 billion to its debt, that this 100 billion, with the same figure, was therefore automatically added either to the private sector's surplus or to the overseas trade sector's surplus. I mean, what would happen is the government adds 100 billion to its debt. This all kaleidoscopes around the economy to a new equilibrium. And in that new equilibrium, those three balances will still equal zero, but at a different level. And I know Mark Lavoie, who the Canadian economics professor who co-authored with Wynne Godley, I've discussed this with him, and he accepts that that is the point, and that is a correct interpretation. So yeah, I mean, MMT regards money as quintessentially debt, as does orthodox central banking, because they can't survive without their precious balance sheet. You know, they want the central bank balance sheet to be balanced. They can't accept the fact that actually on the one side you got nothing, on the other side you got 100 billion. But that's the reality, isn't it? I mean, that 100 billion has literally been created in the digital age at a keystroke from nothing. And that imbalance, they won't allow that imbalance to appear in the system. So they're so worried about it. There are ways, several of us think, around that. But the ultimate worry is that as long as this definition of money as debt is forced upon the funding of government expenditure, then governments can only expend by debt funding, and this runs us into the problem of their debt running to a supposed ceiling of debt to GDP ratio, or financing costs that become excessive in the revenue budget. That leads to austerity. You know, so I mean, poorer people, lower income groups suffer terribly by this definition of money as debt. So both in terms of philosophy and ontology and in terms of this practical outworking, I want to argue pretty vociferously that money is not quintessentially debt. Although, as you say, it can then be rendered as debt when the commercial bank creates the money and then lends it on. So then, of course, it's created a debt, but creating the money itself is not debt. On the ecological economy, yeah, I agree. And I often think when I make my presentation, there aren't two big faults in the economy that I identify of insufficient income and excessive debt. There is also the huge fault of ecological damage. And I'm entirely with you on that. It's simply that my own expertise hasn't allowed me to dig much further into that very important third or maybe probably first deficiency of the economy. And I'd refer people to books like Dieter Helm's book on economics of ecology. And I also agree with you that AI does look extraordinarily power hungry. How are we going to generate all this power? The same with electric vehicles. On goals, I again agree with you. Yes, I know the donut economics thesis and so on. And yeah, I mean, I would also agree with you that we want to see the economy aware of holistic humanity. You know, that it isn't just goods and services that we have, but there are all sorts of other aspects to our being, to our life experience, and to what it is to be a fulfilled human being and to be a fulfilled society. So I totally agree, and I accept that in the presentations I've made, I have rather limited the idea of economy to the production of goods and services. But I agree with you that a more holistic definition is needed.
Thank you. Carolyn, I think we need to move on, and I'm going to jump ahead to Adrian. So sorry, Patrick, John, and Joe, but Adrian hasn't asked a question yet, and so I think this is our last question, and then we'll have to move on to the next speaker. Go ahead, Adrian.
Thanks, Lucille. I want to say something about the debt question. I think most of the time, most of the discussion about debt is money as debt. It has to do with the origin of the money and whether the debt is to the originator, whoever that may be. But I just want to invoke Sadi, who 100 years ago or so pointed out that money is inherently, I'm not an MMTer either, by the way, but that money is inherently debt in the sense that a dollar in my hand is a ticket to consume whatever's available in the market for sale. And it's a debt that society owes me because I have that dollar. So the dollar is a debt in that other direction. It's a debt to society and to the environment. So anyway, so money in my sense, I disagree. I would say money is a debt in that sense. So anyway, I just make this observation. Let it go at that.
Thank you, Adrian. I accept that, and I accept qualifications to my argument. I've given in the previous answer the reasons for my argument. I think they're important philosophical and practical reasons for questioning money as debt. But yeah, I mean, as you say, when I've got money in my personal account, I can go out and buy goods and services with it. I don't think, though, that the provider of goods and services has an obligation to provide me. They have an opportunity. So I would think that creating an obligation for the supply of goods and services rather than an obligation would not make the use of the word debt correct.
Well, I don't know that it needs to be an obligation. The provider has voluntarily agreed to provide as a free choice. And so therefore, the market of things that the services and products that we can consume are it's like going to Disneyland or something, and you get a ticket and then you can take the rides. So I don't know that it seems to me that I don't know that it turns, I don't know how obligation can come into that. It seems that the economy provides, the way the whole thing is set up, it provides us with goods and services for whatever reason. But the holders of money inherently, that's a claim that system is indebted to the holders of money. I don't understand what your point about obligation.
Well, if there were an obligation, then I'd regard that as a debt. But if there's not an obligation but an opportunity, I wouldn't regard it as a debt. I mean, I do understand what you're saying, and I think the terminological finesse is quite difficult there. But for the other reasons I've given, I do continue to prosecute my argument that it's at the point of creation not debt because it didn't exist a minute before. And when the central bank buys back government debt, it renders it not debt. I think that's another important. See, if I'm working towards an argument for direct money financing, QE, as much faulted as it clearly was, nevertheless was a gift horse to my argument because it created in the UK 875 billion worth of government expenditure, which is no longer debt funded. It was debt funded by money creation. And I think we ought to pick up on that and say it has validated the claim that government expenditure can be funded by money creation, not by debt.
Well, one last thing. I guess, again, once an economy is set up and running, and once producers voluntarily, let's say, enter into the production process once that's set up and going, it seems to me that there's a sense of obligation involved. I certainly feel kind of obligated to earn and spend money in the economy, and if I do so, it seems to me the economy owes me as a holder is indebted to me. I don't. Anyway, we can. I'll let it go.
Yeah, me too.
Some people think of money too as social equity, and there's been some writing around that in a more general sense to try to.
Michael Kumhoff's big on that, as is Joseph Huber, and I know both Michael and Joseph, so no, I agree.
Yeah.
I think we should probably take the 3-minute break left to the top of the hour. I have a question too, but I have bought your 2 most recent books, and I will find my answer in there, I hope.
Thank you so much, Lucille.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, very much for your work and for being here today and other days as well.
Thank you for the invitation. Very much appreciated.
Thank you too.
Okay, so that was a very short break, but we have a good 15 minutes. So Jeff and Dr. Haydorn, maybe even if Jeff, you have a comment for Oliver, and Oliver, if you have a comment for Jeff, and then we will move on to as many questions.
No, I mean, I welcome what Oliver shared with us and subscribe to it all, apart from him saying that it wasn't basic income. I mean, you differentiate the proposal from basic income by saying basic income is tax or debt funded. And of course, there are some schemes that are like that. I mean, my friend Malcolm Torrey and Stuart Lansley have both created schemes, UBI schemes, which are tax funded. But there was a reason for that. The reason is to try to get in the thin edge of the wedge, if you like, to be able to say to the present political administrations, look, there is a version that is revenue neutral. So, but in my own writing, certainly it's equivalent to what Douglas says, that you'd have a basic income funded by debt-free sovereign money. But this curious thing to me actually is that Keynes, as you probably know, is rather derisory of Douglas, and then the closing pages of the general theory, he sort of puts him down without any rationale. It's just some kind of emotional rejection from Keynes to Douglas. So I've never figured out why that is. I think it's mainly because Keynes, of course, was trying to argue for wage. You know, he's arguing for wage as income, and that wage was an expression of demand and not just a cost of production. So he was seeking to turn neoclassical theory on its head, which is why he didn't welcome a sort of a non-wage proposal from Douglas. But that's my only guess.
Yes, Keynes actually had been present when C.H. Douglas provided evidence before the British Macmillan Committee. I think that was 1930. And we have the record of their discussion. You know, Keynes was asking certain questions and Douglas was responding. We tend to think that Keynes went down the road he went down because the idea of giving individuals money and therefore independence and freedom through the national dividend was one step too far as the powers that be were concerned. They couldn't countenance something so radical. And so Keynes, in effect, he finds another way of filling the gap through government spending. With regards to the basic income thing, I suppose one of the reasons, in addition, that we are not inclined to call the national dividend a universal basic income or to put it under that rubric is that it depends on the size of the gap. So it's not, the national dividend is not guaranteed. As I was saying in the presentation, if too many people decide, no, we're not going to work, we're just going to, we'll loaf, and production declines, then it will become more and more difficult to meet basic costs with the dividend. So the dividend is indexed to productivity. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, UBI seems to have this idea of a guaranteed amount. And we say, well, it can fluctuate. It goes up and down depending on how well the economy is performing and what it can actually afford.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's okay, John.
Yeah. So I just one question. Are both of you familiar with this book by Macmillan, The End of Banking?
I'm not.
Neither of you? I would encourage you to look at it. They have a newer, this is 2014, but just as I listen to each of you, they have maybe a third variance. It's not basic income, it's not universal basic income. It's not, yeah, it's not even, I guess you use the term, Oliver, universal. They use the term unconditional income. And it's in chapter 10, a crucial, really their reform policy, but the difference, it's a monetary policy. Unconditional income is only a means to an end, the end being price stability. But it's universal in the sense that it goes to everybody when the purchasing power of money needs this new injection of money to keep it stable, and not across months and years, but across generations is their goal. And they basically call for the public organization of money and the private organization of credit, as in the borrowing, lending, investing of already existing money. I will stop there and bring Elizabeth to ask a question, unless either of you want to comment. You can do that first. Whoops. I think we lost others. Anyhow, Elizabeth, go ahead with your question.
Okay. Well, basically, what I get from all those things is that our major problem is that all money is created with debt. And as the economy increases, we need more money. Now, what would be the mechanics of doing that? Like, I get every Christmas a nice Christmas card from our Prime Minister. Maybe there should be a $10 bill, a $100 bill in it, or whatever. So as the economy increases, more money should be in circulation. But how are the mechanics of doing that? Would it just spend cash and then distribute it to people? And one of my questions is, I know that Gaddafi distributed the profits from the oil to the people. How did he do it? Did he just hand out everybody money, or what is the mechanics of doing it? We can't, we can print paper money and give it to everybody. How can you do it? That's my question.
Well, as far as the Douglas social credit proposals are concerned, the added money is in fact the dividend and the discount. So there are at least two ways that could be done. You could have a system of state-mediated credit creation, where this debt-free injection is provided through the banking system, or you could use what in AMI circles is termed public money, or something like the greenback money, where you are providing additional money through the state's power of coinage, essentially. And yeah, the basic idea from a DSC point of view anyway is that the economy actually needs debt-free input.
Yes.
Because of the gap, we can't, if we didn't have a gap, if there wasn't the price income gap, you could run an economy on a debt-based system and it wouldn't cause as many problems as it's causing. But because we have a debt-based system, the only way to fill a gap is to borrow more money into existence to meet existing production debts. And that obviously is a system that doesn't solve the problem, but merely kicks the can down the road. And it gets worse and worse over time. So bottom line from Douglas is that the economy and individuals and the whole society needs a debt-free input if you're going to have a debt money system at all.
But how you do it? Do you just print paper money and give it to people? You can't just say to the banks, okay, here is government money, we put it in. How you physically do it? And that is my question.
Why not? Why can't you just have everybody's bank account and stick $1,000 in it electronically?
But who puts it in? The government?
Yeah.
The government says, okay, here is $1,000.
Yeah. Why not?
that can be done?
Yeah.
The National Credit Office.
Thank you,
So if
Elizabeth.
you don't have a bank account, what
Ah,
happens?
well, it would be a big incentive to get one, wouldn't it?
Thank you,
Okay.
Elizabeth. We will jump ahead to Ellen and then John and Joe.
Thanks. I appreciated both of your presentations. Thank you very much. My questions are for Oliver. Great to meet you by Zoom. I've studied your work quite a bit. I just want to say one thing to Elizabeth. Our government has done that, and what they did was send out basically debit cards that were worth a certain amount. So whether or not you had a banking account, you could use this debit card and cash it out. So my questions are, what I've never understood was B. If B is capital expenditures, it seems to me that they still are going to somebody. They're going to producers, they're going to pay the rent on the equipment or whatever. And so that's somebody in the economy who could then spend the money. So that's my first question. My second question is, you mentioned that private banks would still be creating the credit as they are now, but that it would be limited to productive purposes, not speculative purposes. Well, we'd like to do that too in our public banking models, but I don't know how you would actually implement that. I mean, how does a bank know what somebody is borrowing the money for? And even if if they go to great lengths to find out, how do they know what it's going to be invested in, or whether that's going to be a productive investment? Anyway, those are my two questions.
Okay. So regarding the first question, the B payments, we say that the B payments are revenue, business revenue, not consumer income. And so some of that revenue is going to be destroyed. It went into prices, but it was never converted into consumer income. Some of it could get locked into the system. So if businesses develop reserves of various kinds, the money that's going through that channel is helping to build up costs and prices, but it's not being transformed into consumer income of proper persons, wages, salaries, dividends in the same period, or perhaps not at all. This is it's a very subtle and difficult thing to understand, perhaps. But one of the examples that Douglas gives is, let's say you run a complete credit cycle. Someone borrows money, $100,000, they pay workers to set up a factory. They then issue shares. They collect the 100,000 from the workers. The money and the debt cancel each other out. You now have an industrial asset in existence, and businesses will levy charges on that for to replace it, to maintain it, etc., etc. But the money that was involved in its creation is gone. That's past history. So his basic idea is you've got all these industrial assets that are building up that businesses are charging for, but there's no automatic consumer income on the other side of the equation to balance the costs. And so that's why you have to go in and use a credit card, because your wages are not sufficient to cover all the costs that businesses have to cover in order to remain in operation. The other question, how can we, I suppose, eliminate or cut down, at least on the speculative element? That is something which there are different ways that it could be done, and different social creditors have different ideas. But you could have, for example, 100% reserve system that's exogenous. In other words, private banks would be able to create credit, but then the NCO would have to back all their credit with equivalent in reserves. So if they create 100,000 to lend to a business, the NCO would have to backstop that with 100,000 in reserves. The minute that it becomes clear that a bank doesn't have a very good record, is making very risky or silly decisions, and of course we're assuming that in itself would be restricted because of legislation that we put in place. But the NCO could say, no, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. No more. I'm not going to let you create any more credit because you violated the terms of our agreement. And without the reserves, they wouldn't be able to continue. So Douglas said that private banks should be licensed, and to ensure that they're serving the common interest, common policy. And if it turns out that some bank is creating a problem, well, they can be sanctioned or they can be delicensed, I suppose. That's a very broad answer to your question, but
Okay.
yeah.
Well, of course, banks would fail if they were making risky loans, et cetera, that didn't pay off. But I wouldn't call a productive loan just necessarily one that pays back. I'm talking about things like investing in hedge funds that are speculating. I mean, strictly betting on things that do not produce anything. They're just driving up the price of assets. Is there a way to limit that? I wish I knew of such a way.
Mm-hmm. I suppose you could do it through legislation.
Yeah.
Well,
I
that's
guess you
something.
haven't thought through it either.
Well,
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you, Ellen.
we will move on to John. Thanks, Ellen. Ugh, sorry, somebody else spotlighting. Thanks, John.
Just very quickly to answer Ellen's question, it's only sociopaths who do the hedge fund stuff. So lock them up. The other thing that Douglas is proposing altogether, and I'm sort of just checking with you, is that the people have a say in the price structure. That the question is are the costs being externalized? And if they're being externalized, then you raise the price, and then you give people enough money to pay it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Under the existing system, goods and services that are cheaper have a double advantage. They have the natural advantage of, well, the fact that they're cheaper, but also there's the fact that people, maybe they would want other things, but they can't afford it, right? They'd have to go into debt in order to buy the things that they actually prefer. But if you ensure from the get-go that there's always enough consumer income to balance out costs and prices, then things that people can't afford now would become affordable. And we might find that people will want items that last a lot longer, that they won't go with the cheapest items with built-in obsolescence because, not simply because they're cheaper, but maybe the only thing they can afford. So it would change the whole dynamics of what they really want would be more easily reflected in their choices because they would be sufficiently enfranchised with consumer buying power.
One other little thing. Douglas was really clear that he was being political. This is a possible solution. He wasn't saying this is the ideal, but this would solve the problem. And it should be politically doable. And that the fact that he couldn't even get it done where they elected a social credit government should just tell us all something. I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Jeff, do you have any comment before we move on?
No, let the questions go.
Okay.
Is
Steve, should we
is
take
there a
one more?
question? Yeah, is there a quick question for Jeff? Because Oliver's had two. Does someone have a quick question for Jeff? Joe, do
I
you?
do.
Okay,
I do.
Joe.
It applies to Oliver, but it's for Jeff. Jeff, one of the versions of UBI that has been discussed is universal basic services, so that we do have a limit not on the money but on the resources, land, labor, and capital. And as the quote we were given about providing the best possible goods applies to that we need to focus on the essential goods and services. We've got to make sure they're met first. They have to be the highest priority goods and services. And then if we have more, we have things left over, then we can use spend them on less essential goods and services. So the proposal is that the money be spent not on on providing education, on health, on infrastructure, on a sustainable planet, all those things. It relates to the freedom budget. We talked about that with Les Leopold yesterday, Martin Luther King's approach. Also, one of those essentials is a living wage job, which would also help to reduce the need for UBI. And if some individuals, no matter what, need more, then you could have individual welfare. Would that be acceptable in your scheme of things?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion, as you know, in our circles. I mean, Anna Coote in the UK is a great proponent of UBS. She sees it rather than UBI. But again, I mean, in the UK, we already have more UBS than you have in the States because we have a free at point of use health service. My view is, of course, this is slightly a political and philosophical question, but my view is that universal basic services can apply quite readily to health and education because most of us want the same things in health and education. You know, if I've broken my leg, I want it fixed. If I want my kid to learn French, to learn French. You know, there's a kind of similarity. But I think that in other scopes, like what house I want to live in, what transport means I want to use, that there's more dissimilarity in what each person might choose. And I do believe in a sort of a free society where the individual is enabled to choose through a basic income rather than rather patronized by the state as to what they're going to have. And if it were free at the point of consumption, how are you going to limit the demand for it? So you made chocolate free at the base. That means I'm exaggerating a bit. Then, of course, you know, the demand become. I remember when I was a kid, you see, I lived in public sector housing. And we used to, every 2 years, those houses' front doors are painted by the local council. And as kids, we used to stand around saying, you know, what colour's our house door going to be? And they'd say, it's going to be crushed strawberry, you know, that's been decided by some bureaucrat in the city council. Most of us kids had never heard of crushed strawberry. And the point was, at the end of the day, I came away thinking, I'd like to decide what colour my front door is. So in that sense, I'm rather wary of the patronising nature implied by universal basic services beyond health and education. And I'm in favour of giving people choice with a basic income.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for your presentations and your responses. What is maybe most exciting is that so many of us are doing serious work systemically and in the real world and motivated by the common values that I think have been expressed. So keep up the work and keep in dialogue with each other and with us, and maybe our grandchildren or their grandchildren will actually have a sustainable, just, peaceful, flourishing, not simply surviving life within this planet to live.
Agreed.
So thank you.
We have a little bit of